Welcome to the magnificent honeybee. My name is Jill Kilhefner. This presentation focuses on the fascinating life of the honeybee. I live in a residential neighborhood in Valparaiso, Indiana with my husband Rob. We have 1 acre that we garden and keep bees on. Our gardens include flowers, vegetables, herbs, and fruits. I've been a Porter County Master Gardener since 2011, and my husband has declared himself a Master Hole Digger and Mulch Slinger. In 2012, my husband gave me a garden beehive for my birthday, and we began our beekeeping adventure together. We usually have 2 beehives in the yard. We keep bees because it's interesting and fun, and to do our small part to support a healthy environment. We only take honey if there's a surplus and do not sell it, but use it and gift it to lucky family and friends. We try to grow plants in the garden that provide shelter and food for the birds and pollinators that visit our home. And now to the honeybee. There are 20,000 different bee species in the world, and North America is home to about 4,400 bee species. Honeybees are actually not native to the United States, but were brought here by immigrating Europeans in the early 1600s to produce wax and honey. Apis mellifera is the western honeybee, apis meaning bee-like and mellifera meaning honey-bearing. This bee produces honey and beeswax and is a primary pollinator of many agricultural crops. Apis mellifera is the only bee species kept by beekeepers in America, and there are at least 20 subspecies. Let's review some beekeeping terminology. The colony is the biological living unit of tens of thousands of workers, drones, and a queen. The hive is the structure in which bees live and are kept. The honeycomb is a sheet of hexagonal wax cells made by honeybees to store honey, pollen, and brood. And the brood are the eggs, larvae, and pupa in the hive. Inside the colony, there are thousands of bees who work together to function as a whole, which is called a superorganism. There are 3 types of bees: the workers, who are female, the queen, and the drones, who are male. Each of these bees has a specific role or set of duties. Honeybees undergo complete metamorphosis, which describes the development of the bee from an egg to an adult. All bees begin as eggs laid by the queen of their colony. She places 1 egg at the bottom of each cell. For 3 days, the egg develops within the shell, and on the 3rd day, the egg shell dissolves, releasing a tiny grub-like larva. The worker bees add a specially blended food to the cell, which the larva eats and floats in as it grows. When the larva is ready to pupate, it stops feeding and produces a thin, silk-like cocoon that covers its entire body. The worker bees then cover the cell with wax until the larva pupates or transforms into an adult bee. Once the transformation is complete, the new adult bee pushes and chews its way out of its cell. There is 1 queen per colony, and she is the mother of the hive because she's solely responsible for the reproduction of the colony. She is the largest bee in the hive, but takes the shortest time to transform from egg to queen, just 16 days compared to the 21 days for worker bees and 24 days for drones. Larvae destined to become queens are fed royal jelly, which is a rich, nutritious mix of protein-rich pollen, honey for carbohydrates, and enzymes that support the development of her reproductive organs and hormone-producing glands that she needs to fulfill her role as queen bee. The cells in which queens are raised are different than worker or drone cells. Because of the enriched diet, queen larvae are larger and require more room. Their cells are about the size of a peanut shell and are easy to identify on the comb. These cells are generally placed between frames or at the bottom of a frame. Queen bees are produced for several reasons: to replace a lost queen through injury, in preparation for swarming, or to replace a failing but still present queen. When a replacement queen is needed, the colony will make as many as they can to ensure success. When the first queen bee emerges from her cell, she will destroy as many of the still developing queens as she can, thus eliminating the competition. If several queens emerge at the same time, they will meet and fight to the death until one is victorious. For 2 to 3 days, the victorious queen feeds and continues to mature. She then leaves the hive for orientation flights near the colony so she can find her way home after her mating flights. When she is ready, she leaves the hive to mate. She doesn't mate with drones from her own colony to avoid inbreeding. Mating occurs in the air above open fields or forest clearings. She emits an inviting pheromone, which is a distinct odor or perfume that attracts the drones. She will mate with multiple drones over the course of several days and store the sperm. After mating, the queen returns to the hive where she will remain for the rest of her life. She is a prolific egg layer. At first, she will lay a few hundred eggs a day, but in later spring and early summer, she can lay up to 2,000 eggs in a single day. She deposits these eggs in a circular pattern starting at the center of the frame. This is called the brood nest. The cells around the brood nest are filled with food stores. After mating, the queen changes, and she produces different pheromones that the colony uses to identify her as their queen. As the workers feed and groom her, they pick up small amounts of these pheromones and spread them throughout the hive. This identifies the hive as hers and helps the foraging worker bees return to the correct hive when faced with multiple hives in the same location. When a queen begins to fail after a few years, her pheromone levels drop. The worker bees detect this and will begin to plan for her replacement. When a hive becomes overcrowded in late spring and early summer, the colony begins preparing for dividing or swarming. Swarming is a natural process used to deal with overcrowding in a hive and is another way of reproduction. Half of the colony is triggered to slow production and pack up in preparation to move. The workers begin creating queen cells to raise a new queen, and forager bees begin scouting for new homes, usually a hollow tree or an empty beehive. The queen slows her egg laying, eats less food, and then stops laying completely. She slims down, which allows her to fly again. This is the only other time a queen will leave the hive. When the queen larvae begin pupating and the cells are capped with wax, this signals the reigning queen to move to a new residence. Suddenly, the workers, a few drones, and the queen leave, pouring out of the front of the hive by the thousands. It is an incredible sight to see. My husband witnessed swarming from one of our hives a couple years ago and was able to capture the event using his cell phone camera. The colony organizes and settles at a nearby location, often a tree branch. Scout bees join the waiting swarm and communicate the location of the new home, and everyone mobilizes again and moves in. Lucky beekeepers can intercede, capture a swarm, and create a new hive, as we were able to do with this swarm in our neighbor's tree last year. Luckily, they were on a very low branch, and we were able to gently drop the swarm into an empty beehive box. Because the queen was present, the bees stayed with her instead of flying off. This is the video we took that day. After dropping the bees into the box, we stood back and waited for the bees to move in. It was really fun to watch. After the majority of the bees had moved in, which took about 20 minutes, my husband carried the hive box to its new home in the garden, and the bees left behind actually followed him in the air. It was one of the most exciting days we've had as beekeepers. Meanwhile, in the original hive, a new queen emerges and the process of growing the colony continues. When pollen and nectar sources begin to dwindle, egg laying is slowed or stopped completely. A queen may live as long as 5 years, but is usually replaced by the colony in 2 to 3 years. Worker bees are female bees. During the active season, there can be 60,000 workers in a colony. Worker bees are responsible for the overall management of the resources needed and made by the colony, including raising the young and caring for the queen, foraging for nectar and pollen, producing wax, comb, and honey, cleaning the cells and removing the dead, defending the hive against intruders, providing metabolic heat when it's cold and ventilation when it's hot, and preparing for winter by accumulating and storing reserves. The worker bee has the greatest cognitive power of the 3 types of bees. Queens and drones are task-specific for their entire lives, but a worker's tasks change as she ages. However, worker bees remain flexible enough that they can switch between tasks if needed. A worker bee develops from an egg to an adult in 21 days. During the active season, she will live and work for 5 to 6 weeks. After emerging, she needs to eat high-protein pollen. Within a day or two, she joins the labor force as a house bee and stays close to the center of the hive. Her first job is to clean the newly vacated cells, which are then reinforced and polished in preparation for a new egg. After a few days, her next role is to feed larvae. She may feed and groom the queen during this time as well. As house bees work, they pick up and distribute small amounts of the queen's pheromones throughout the hive. If something is amiss with the queen, the colony will know it and plan for action. After a few more days, the worker ventures away from the center and travels to the entrance where she will receive nectar and pollen loads from the returning foragers. These workers determine how much nectar and pollen to receive based on the number of larvae that need to eat and the space that's available in the hive. The older house bees continue to do the house cleaning chores, like removing dead bees and debris, building comb, and evaporating nectar to make honey. After 2 to 3 weeks, a worker's flight muscles are developed and she begins short orientation flights. Her stinging mechanism has also developed, and she is now capable of defending the hive. Therefore, her next role is as a guard bee. The guard bees position themselves at the hive entrance and inspect incoming bees. Because each colony has its own distinct and recognizable odor, the inspection is odor-based. If a bee attempts entry to a colony that she does not belong to, she will be challenged at the door. Generally, there are fewer than 100 guard bees at the entrance in peak season. However, if there is a threat to the hive, thousands of available bees will show up for duty. Other insects and animals that may try to enter the hive to take honey are also challenged by the guards. The guards wrestle and bite insects or sting the intruding animals to drive it off. When confronted by a large intruder, like a bear or a human beekeeper, they will try to intimidate before stinging. The guard bees join forces and fly at the intruder's face, attracted by their eyes and breath, as a warning. If this doesn't work, they sting. The stinger is a 3-part apparatus, controlled by muscles that pierce the skin of the intruder. It is connected to organs that produce venom and acid, and that's injected into the skin. When the stinger is embedded, the muscles contract continuously, pushing the stinger deeper and injecting venom with each contraction. Obviously, and if you've ever been stung, you know, this hurts. Because the stinger is barbed, the bee can't withdraw it, and as she tries to fly away, it's torn from her body, causing a mortal wound. When the bee stings, alarm pheromones are released, alerting the whole colony that an intruder is threatening the hive. It marks the intruder, which allows the guards to hone in on the predator. If the threat persists, the number of guards increase, which usually drives the intruder off. That's why beekeepers use smoke when opening an active hive. The smoke masks the pheromones used to raise the alarm. When the worker bee is about 3 to 4 weeks old, she becomes a forager. Foragers harvest plant resources that the colony needs, including nectar, pollen, and propolis. They also bring in water. Foraging is complex, and the bees are skilled at exploiting the resources. For example, some plants produce flowers only at certain times of the day. Bees will learn these patterns and visit only when the flower is open so that they can harvest nectar or pollen or both. They gather from trees, shrubs, and flowers, including what we consider weeds. Propolis is a sticky resinous substance made by plants. Bees gather propolis and take it to the hive where it is used to seal cracks and crevices, which makes the hive wind and waterproof. Propolis also has antimicrobial properties and is believed to be part of the bee's defense against diseases. If something like a mouse gets into the hive, the bees will kill it, but because the mouse is too big for them to remove from the hive, they cover it in propolis, which retards bacterial and fungal growth. This keeps the body from rotting, and it just dries out. Some forager bees are scouts. Scouts seek out food using the color, shape, markings, and aromas of flowers. When a scout finds a promising area, she assesses it to determine if it's valuable. She uses her tongue, called a proboscis, to extract and taste the quality of the nectar. If its quality is good, she fills up. Then she leaves the flower, circles the area a few times to get her bearings by noting landmarks and the position of the sun, and then she heads for home. When foragers return to the hive, they share the information with other forager bees. This is another fascinating behavior. Foragers gather in the lower part of the brood nest. The returning forager communicates the location of the source of her harvest using what's called a waggle dance. These motions tell other foragers the distance, which is measured by the amount of energy needed during the trip home, and the direction, based on where the sun is in relation to the colony, of the new patch. The value of her find is communicated by the intensity and duration of her waggle dance. The others will taste and smell the nectar brought in and will follow the dance, which is repeated several times. Then they will leave the hive in search of the location. Many waggle dances are going on at the same time, so a forager will focus on just one. This allows the colony to access many areas at the same time. The worker bees collect nectar from flowers, which is 80% water and 20% sugar, predominantly sucrose. During the flight home, the forager adds an enzyme called invertase to the nectar to begin the ripening process. This changes the chemical structure of the nectar sugar into glucose and fructose. When a forager returns to the hive, she gives the nectar to a receiving house bee, who adds more invertase. She then finds a cell to store and tend the nectar. It will be exposed to the warm air, and the water will begin to evaporate, reducing it to a mixture that contains 18 to 19% water and just over 80% sugar. This is honey. Honey is placed in comb cells until it is full, and then it is sealed with a protective layer of new beeswax. These stores are used to feed the colony when food sources are low, especially during the winter. Here are some astonishing facts. A worker bee produces about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in her lifetime. It takes about 250 bees to fill one cell with honey. A teaspoon of honey takes 5,000 flower visits, and a typical colony will visit 225,000 flowers in a day. Given these statistics, it's fair to say that honey is a very valuable commodity. The goal of every living organism, including plants, is to create offspring for the next generation. One of the ways plants can produce offspring is by making seeds, which requires pollination. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. Pollen is produced in the flower's anthers, and when mature, the anthers shed their pollen. Pollen grains are transferred by pollinators or wind to the stigma of a flower, which then travel to the ovary, which ultimately produces the seed and endosperm. An example of this is a fruit or vegetable. The seeds are in or on the fruit, and the endosperm is the flesh of the fruit. Pollen is transferred by wind, bats and birds, and nectar or pollen-feeding insects, including moths, butterflies, and honeybees. In their quest for nectar, honeybees come into contact with pollen because the flowers don't produce nectar until the pollen is mature. The pollen grains stick to the thousands of hairs on the honeybee. Foragers clean most of these pollen grains out of their hair using their legs and pack them into pollen baskets located on the outside of their hind legs, but some of the pollen is transferred by the honeybee as it travels from flower to flower. If you look closely at the bees in the left picture, you will see the pollen baskets. It's fun to watch bees coming in with pollen and to observe the different colors. When the foragers return to the hive, the pollen is packed tightly into cells. It is stored in cells near the brood nest where it is used to feed brood and the colony in the winter. In the picture on the right, you can see stored pollen on the lower 1/3 of the frame, and look at the different colors. Pollen is the only source of protein, starch, fat, vitamins, and minerals in the colony's diet. By weight, pollen has more protein than beef and is the best food for developing larvae and young adults. At least 75% of flowering plants on Earth need pollinators to reproduce. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is available because of pollinators. 2/3 of the world's food crops require pollination. Food crops that require pollination include fruits such as apples, blueberries, watermelons, strawberries, avocados, blackberries, cranberries, citrus fruits, cherries, peaches, and grapes. Vegetables include cucumbers, onions, celery, mustard, cauliflower, cabbages, peppers, and squashes. Nuts, like almonds and cashews, also require pollination. In addition to the food we eat, pollinators support healthy ecosystems that clean the air, stabilize soils, and support other wildlife by pollinating a major part of bird and mammal diets. This is why it is so important to maintain healthy environments that support all pollinators. There are many factors that affect the well-being of pollinators, and we can all do our part. More on that later. The last type of bee in the colony is the drone. Drones are the males of the colony, and they are different in their physical makeup, their activities, and their contributions to the colony. A drone's sole purpose is to provide his queen's genetics by mating with a queen from another colony. A normal colony produces and supports a small number of drones during the growing season. Drones produce their own pheromones that are recognized as part of the general aroma of the colony. Drone honeybees emerge from an unfertilized egg laid by the queen. The cell in which drones are raised are a bit bigger than the worker cells, but are part of the comb. They are usually located along the edge of the brood nest area. Because the drone is larger, the cap on the cell is domed to provide additional room. Drones take 24 days to develop from an egg to an adult. They have no stinging apparatus, have much bigger eyes than worker bees, and a stout, blunt abdomen. For a few days, the young drones are fed by the worker bees, then they learn to feed themselves honey directly from the storage cells. Their sole function is reproduction, which is done outside the hive. Therefore, they start taking orientation flights near the colony about a week after they emerge from their cells. When the time is right, they begin mating flights. They do not mate with the queen from their own colony. Drones who succeed in mating with the queen fulfill their destiny and die in the process. Those that are unsuccessful in mating return to their hive. Because they do not contribute to the resources of the colony, meaning they don't forage, produce wax or honey, or care for the young, drones are expensive for the colony to support. In order to ensure the continuation of the queen's genes in the general honeybee population, they are allowed to remain when food is plentiful. When the food supply dwindles, for instance in a drought or after the first frost, the colony downsizes its drone population. The workers will destroy drone larvae, the queen ceases to lay drone eggs, and the workers kick the adult drones out, leaving them to starve or die of exposure. In the fall, we've seen the evicted drones laying outside of the hive. In this picture, you can see a drone chewing his way out of his cell at the top left of this frame. In late fall, the colony downsizes to a core group of worker bees and the queen. When the outside temperature drops below 57 degrees, the bees congregate in the brood nest area. The bees climb into cells and fill the spaces between the comb, forming a compact cluster. It's like a ball of bees. They vibrate their wing muscles to create heat. They eat honey and pollen that's stored in the comb. The queen is inside the cluster, and the workers rotate their position to stay warm, much like penguins do. They keep the hive around 50 degrees inside during the winter, but inside the cluster where the queen is, it's closer to 95 degrees. Bees do not eliminate their waste in the hive. They will hold it until we get those warmer days in winter, usually above 45 degrees, and then they will get out of the hive, stretch their wings, and eliminate their waste. This is known as a cleansing flight. As beekeepers, we anxiously wait for those days and breathe a sigh of relief when we see the bees emerge, knowing that they're making it through the winter. Around the winter solstice, the workers raise the temperature in the hive, and the queen begins laying eggs to prepare for spring. As spring approaches, the bee population is increasing rapidly as the early food sources become plentiful and the weather is favorable. Honeybees gather from dandelions and blooming trees. Colonies managed by beekeepers are moved from crop to pollinate. This is the time for the colony to store away as much pollen and nectar as the hive can accommodate. If beekeepers don't give the hive additional space by adding boxes with frames inside, the colony responds to the cramped quarters by swarming. By late June, many of the flowers are done blooming and there is little forage available. Colonies go on hold, living on stored food. This time period is called the dearth. When the days are hot and humid and the bees are trying to cure the honey inside the hive, many of the workers will hang out on the outside of the hive to allow for better airflow. Bees will line the entrance and fan their wings to increase the air circulation inside the hive. This is called bearding, and it's pretty fantastic to see. The first time we saw it, we were concerned that something was wrong with the colony because we didn't understand what was happening. By late summer, fall blooming plants like goldenrod kick in, and once again, the bees get busy bringing in stores for the winter. This time period is called the fall flow. By mid-November, or after the first frost that kills most of the plants, the colony begins its slow time. The queen has slowed her egg laying and the winter bees are raised. These winter bees actually have additional fat stores that help support them through the winter. This is the time that the colony downsizes by kicking out the drones and the worker population is decreased by attrition. It's a bit sad to see the many dead bees laying around the hives in the fall. For obvious reasons, most people do not want to be beekeepers, but everybody can do their part to protect pollinators. You can support pollinators by incorporating pollinator-friendly landscape and gardens into your property. Leave areas of your property as natural as possible and reduce lawn space. Allow native species of trees and plants to grow because they have co-evolved with our pollinators and are dependent on each other. Encourage beneficial insects by providing plants and safe havens. Avoid using chemicals that affect pollinators and their plants. Leave dead trees and don't mow down undergrowth. These provide habitat. And create nesting sites by installing nesting boxes for birds and bat houses on trees or poles. If you have the space, invite a beekeeper to put hives on your property. Check the city ordinances first and you can find local beekeepers at your area farm markets or by checking state and county beekeeping websites. If you are interested in beekeeping, there are a lot of resources you can check out. The Purdue Extension Education Store is online, and it has a lot of free gardening and honeybee educational materials. Beekeeping supply companies also have great educational information on their websites, as does YouTube for beekeeping videos. This concludes our presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the honeybee and are inspired to have pollinator-friendly practices in your home. Thank you for joining us for the magnificent honeybee. This presentation was created by Jill Kilhefner and may not be used or reproduced without her consent.